Saludos, familia. Greetings, family. My name is Nancy Lopez. I'm professor of sociology at the University of New Mexico. And it's my pleasure to serve as a facilitator for this panel focused on celebrating interdisciplinary perspectives as integral to feminisms. And I want to thank our presidenta, la doctora Roberta Villalón, for inviting me and for conceiving of this panel. I also want to thank our panelists for being here on such a gorgeous afternoon in New Mexico. And I want to start it off this panel with a quote that comes from Gloria Anzaldúa, and I quote, "Necesitamos teorías that will rewrite history using race, gender, and ethnicity as categories of analysis. Theories that cross borders, blur boundaries, new kinds of theories with new theorizing methods," end quote. I invite you to think and share the interdisciplinary knowledge projects that have shaped your liberation praxis. So a few of the speakers will be joining us virtually. Each speaker will have about 10 to 12 minutes, and there's one presentation that has 2 speakers, so we'll double the time there. And they will speak with about, I will give them a 2-minute warning before they start. So we are gonna go in the order that you see in your program. So Dr. Rayan Kano, Professor Emeritus from the University of Sydney, will be talking about, on a world scale in the real world, tasks for feminist sociology. Thank you.
Okay, I hope we have a successful connection. Thank you. Excellent. Thank you for the invitation to join you. I would love to be with you on a beautiful early summer day. I'm afraid we have somewhat different conditions here in the Southwest Pacific, where there have been some terrible floods recently, but nevertheless, the wonders of technology allow us to be together virtually. I want to raise questions about the global shape of the feminist sociology project, feminist knowledge projects generally. And I want to start with an observation made about 30 years ago by a feminist scholar from Algeria in Muslim North Africa, a scholar called Mani El-Azraq, who wrote a quite powerful article remarking that there was what she called a significant error in feminist scholarship. The situation of Algerian feminists was that they actually had to fight 2 struggles at the same time. One was against the patriarchal men in their own country, and that was and is a serious struggle. But the other was against the dominance in the feminist world of ideas and methods of the scholarship of the global north. In the case of Algeria, former colony of France, that particularly meant French feminist scholarship and thought. But the point applies, of course, much more generally. About 20 years ago, an Indigenous scholar in Australia, in my country, called Aileen Morton Robinson, published a book called Talking Up to the White Woman, which was basically a critique of feminism as it existed in Australia at the time, including feminist scholarship in the universities, for essentially marginalising the Indigenous people of the country, for failing to think through the issues that were familiar in feminist discourse, and basically institutionalizing a racist agenda for feminism and a racist framing of feminist thought. Now, What had happened in this case was not any particularly intentional racism on the part of white feminists, but an effect of the global economy of knowledge, the way our knowledge systems work, and the way that feminist scholarship has been constituted within it, within the world of disciplinary research-based knowledge that's institutionalized in our universities and other knowledge institutions. I want to give you a little example of the problem. Not long ago, I looked up the National Women's Studies Association website, something that I'm sure you are familiar with and many of your students will use as a knowledge resource. And on that website, there's a very useful list of 76 feminist or feminist-related journals that people can consult for to acquire feminist knowledge. I went through the list and counted, and it turns out that of the 76, just 6 are journals based outside North America and Western Europe. In other words, the area of the world that holds about 14% of the world's populations, according to this guide, produces about 92% of the world's feminist-related knowledge. Now, in fact, that is wrong. There are, in fact, many sources of knowledge from outside those areas, but that is a typical pattern in the global economy of knowledge as it is institutionalized in our universities, in curricular studies, especially in the Anglosphere. Now, I could go on for a long time about this issue. I've written 1 or 2 books about it. One called Southern Theory, the most recent called The Good University. Please excuse the advertisement. But I don't want to double up on what other people will have said at the conference. I want to move straight to the main thing that I want to say, which is to think about what can we do about the immense global imbalances in the production of knowledge in our own area. And I want to suggest 4 kinds of things that people can do, and not just scholars in the global north, but this applies more generally. However, it does apply to scholarship in the global north. The first thing is to support the building of a feminist knowledge workforce and communications system on a world scale, which means especially paying attention to where this is most difficult, and that is the global south. In the National Women's Studies Association guide, which I mentioned before, I found missing some excellent journals, which I happen to know about, and which are places where we can go to acquire knowledge, to make connections, to see what is going on in other parts of the world, and especially to find contexts in which support can be given. Those of you who speak Spanish will probably know Debate Feminista from Mexico. Those of you who have a bit of Portuguese will know Cadernos Pagu in Brazil. Those of you who don't know these languages should ask friends or connections who do to give you some idea of what's going on with them. Those of you who know English will find a really excellent journal called Feminist Africa, which is published, is available open access through the website of CODESRIA, the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa. So there are ways of connecting, and there is an immense scope for assistance, connection, and support to the development of a workforce of scholarship, of feminist knowledge and scholarship across the global south. The second thing we need to do is to transform the process of making knowledge. That is to rethink our methods in feminist scholarship from the viewpoint of the global south, from colonized peoples from the viewpoint of post-colonial societies. I want to give just one example for this, for those of you who are keen on quantitative methods. There's an excellent book called Indigenous Statistics. The co-author of this is Maggie Walter, a feminist colleague of mine in Australian sociology, an Indigenous scholar in Australia. The book discusses the advent of statistical methodology in the social sciences in colonial societies, the impact on colonized people where this form of knowledge has largely been used as a means of control of accumulating knowledge in the hands of the colonizers or the colonizing state, as it still is in much of the post-colonial world, especially in settler colony societies. But there is an alternative to this, that is to assert data sovereignty on the part of the colonized people and develop means of using quantitative methods, which are useful methods in many circumstances, for the purposes of advancing the interests and conducting resistance to continuing coloniality on the part of Indigenous people. This is not simply a matter of doing qualitative research, but can be done with the techniques of statistics too. The third thing we need to do, and we need to do this on a global scale, is to rewrite our agendas, our intellectual agendas for research, for teaching, our curricula, and so forth, in the light of the history of colonialism, the global history, and the continuing character of the coloniality of institutions and the knowledge they produce. This is an enterprise that is inherently interdisciplinary, and I make no excuses about this. Good post-colonial thinking moves across the familiar barriers of the existing university system quite persistently. And I want to give again one example of this, but a really remarkable example. And that is the work of someone who all feminist scholars should know about. That is Bina Agarwal from India. In disciplinary terms, Bina Agarwal is a development economist. She's also a socialist feminist, an environmental thinker and activist, and someone who has written quite astonishing work which synthesizes sociology, economics, political science, and so forth about a particular issue that is almost missing in global North feminist theory. That is the issue of land. Land, of course, is a central issue in colonialism. Colonial conquest is basically about taking land, taking control of land, as well as taking control of populations. And land is a gender issue. Bina has written a tremendous book called A Field of One's Own, which I heartily recommend to everyone interested in the concerns of post-colonial thought. It's, I think, a great classic of late 20th century feminist theory, and one that should be on all our shelves. And finally, we need to remake our theory to move away from notions like the gender norms, the consensual theory that exists in policy circles like the United Nations. Colonization disrupts gender orders, but responses are creative, and gender orders are constantly being remade in the post-colony. That, I think, is a central concern for feminist thought, for feminist theory. It's happening now, and it's something I think we must all be concerned with and get involved in. Thank you for listening, and I hope the rest of the conference goes well. Bye.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. And we're going to move on to Dr. Blau Buchanan, postdoctoral university fellow at the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at the University of North Carolina, Asheville. And the title of the talk is The Nastiest Shade, Black Trans Feminism and its Sociological Consequences.
Hi, y'all. Wait, there we go. So I'm really excited to talk with y'all about the work that I've done in conjunction with community members about Black trans feminism, and specifically the implications that Black trans feminism has on sociology writ large. As you can see up here, we have Juliana Huxtable, a Black trans woman, artist. She still is alive, exists. You can engage with her work. I say this because often when we talk about Black trans people, we only tend to emphasize those who have passed. Juliana Huxtable was asked in an interview, what's the nastiest shade you've ever thrown? And her response is existing in the world. This is the sort of quote that I want to organize the intervention that I'm hopefully proposing for y'all today.
It's up there.
Oh,
You're not going to see it on your screen.
that's right. Look, I know how to use technology. Okay. Again, just an introduction. I'm a university fellow. My pronouns are they, them. And today's conversation, minimally guided by slides, is really just how to apply a Black trans feminism to our various institutional positions. So I'm going to be talking very specifically about the grounded interventions that, that we can have as a community. This sort of presentation emerges out of a book project, Black Feminist Sociology, Perspectives and Praxis. And specifically a chapter that I worked on with my co-author Ayatunde Ikuku on Black trans feminism and its implications for sociological thinking. I encourage folks who are further interested in this project to check out the website, which includes sort of multimedia aspects of exploring Black feminist thought as it emerges today. Before I get into what Black trans feminism is for myself and for my co-author, I really want to ground us in a conversation about positionality. This particular chapter emerges from a conversation between two Black femme non-binary scholars. And what we attempt to do is chart the geographies of a Black trans feminism and its theoretical interventions into the way we practice and theorize sociological knowledge. Now, when we sort of took up the call of the Black feminist sociology volume, we were really hesitant to participate, largely because we expected pushback, right, on the interventions that we are going to propose. And one of the great, amazing things was finding community in the Black feminist sociological, in our Black feminist sociological circles. So that doesn't mean that it's been well received everywhere. Before we talk about what Black trans feminism is, one of the first things that we have to do is talk about what it means to recover the trans in Black feminism. That would be amazing. Thank you. So fundamentally, why do we need a recovery of the trans in Black feminism? Well, a historical understanding of Black feminist thought really unveils an ambivalent and contested relationship with cisnormativity. The status of womanhood being denied Black women due to historical forces like chattel slavery. Interestingly enough, although this ambivalent position brings Black feminism into conversation with trans embodiment, often Black feminism has had a reliance on the rejection of trans people and the reinstatement of biological claims on womanhood. Obviously, we're not arguing that It is completely inimical to include transness within Black feminism more broadly. Folks like C. Riley Snorton say to feel Black in the diaspora then might be a trans experience. Right? So our goal here with this chapter is to bring experiences of Black racialization specifically in conversation with what it means to be trans and to be a feminist. So what exactly is Black trans feminism? Here, we've got a number of tenets that came out of our conversations, sort of autoethnographic exploration. And there are a number of principles. The first is rejecting realness. If you happen to have been a part of the conversation on radical feminisms and sort of responding to trans exclusionary radical feminists, one of the things that came up was about the taxonomizing and categorizing of bodies. Here we argue that Black trans feminism responds to and rejects realness as a category of analysis. Similarly, we have principles of community care, resisting disposability, and the potential uses of violence. And I'll touch on those in more detail in a moment. Now, what are the demands of a Black trans feminism on sociology writ large? Here, we argue that taking abjection as a philosophical and methodological tool is incredibly important. Part of what we do as sociologists is create taxonomies of difference. That difference relies on states of abjection, particularly when we're talking about the process of global anti-Blackness and colonialism. In addition, one of the demands of a Black trans feminism is the providing of reparations. We've talked a lot today about acknowledging and decolonizing. What does it mean to materially support the folks who are part of our knowledge-making processes? As somebody who does oral history work on Black trans communities, I was surprised to find that paying people for their stories was a shocking and unusual practice. If we want a very simple way of sort of addressing the problems of sociology, we need to talk about reparations, particularly for those whose knowledge making we benefit from. And last is the practice of abolition. And here I might be pushing a little bit further than some folks feel comfortable with, but really asking the question, what would sociology be if it didn't rely on the abjection and exploitation of folks in the global South, colonized others, the figure of the Black trans woman, if we want to talk about them right here at home. This idea of Black trans feminism, I think, is best embodied by this quote by Miss Major, a Black trans icon, fabulous organizer. She says, "You don't have to watch everybody, but love them and give them the space they need." That doesn't mean hugging and smooching on them and holding them close. It means caring about what their existence is, helping as needed, but leaving the room and the ability to grow or not grow, expand or not on their own as they choose. Particularly in a circumstance where sociology makes Black trans folks increasingly visible to a wider audience, we have to really think about what our work does to create, foster, manifest disposability, right, among those folks who are deemed not using the right language, right? I have to think about this as an instructor who teaches about trans stuff and race to a largely white audience, right? How am I preparing them with language that isn't even accessible necessarily to folks within my own community? So what does this mean for sort of our interventions. And here I want to argue that a Black trans feminism is about practicing non-disciplinary work. We've got this, this topic on interdisciplinarity, but I'd like to put forward non-disciplinarity as an alternative framework. And this builds from a few key areas that I think speak to Black trans feminist principles. The first of these is the undercommons. Harney and Moten write about the undercommons to scholars, and they argue that the only possible relationship to the university today is a criminal one. And this is something that I think is an incredibly important thank you, is an incredibly important intervention. Too often, I think, in our efforts to sustain our place in the academy, as precarious as that is, we often make distinctions about the right kind of people we're willing to put ourselves at risk for. And part of what the Undercommons argues is that criminality is something that should be embraced. Black trans feminism incorporates these principles of the undercommons, of a criminal relationship to the university. And here in particular, the idea that the scam can be a useful tool of sociological practice. What do I mean by that? For example, when I do oral histories, even if a person decides to bow out, they still get paid. Right? Which means that I can have a lot of interviews that don't happen, that it may not produce a final product or work, but I still accomplish the central goal, which was the redistribution of university resources to the communities at hand. And the last part that I sort of want to touch on is the idea of using every tool at our disposal. Here I have a quote from Marsha P. Johnson. This is from a chapter on STARS, the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries. Marsha says, "We believe in picking up the gun, starting a revolution if necessary." Here, I argue that disciplinary boundaries are inimical to the work demanded by Black trans feminism, and specifically that our methods, our strategies, epistemologies should always be oriented towards liberation. So if we lack the tools in our own discipline to accomplish this goal, we should follow, right, whatever disciplinary methodological path helps us to answer and to respond to this call more broadly. Right? So the goal at the end of this presentation is to really challenge y'all to think about your different positionalities and to think about manifesting that relationship of criminality in whatever positionality you happen to have. Scam well, and really think about how the university is a place of capital accumulation, land, money, etc. Black trans feminism is asking you to aid, right, in the work of collective liberation. Thank you.
Gracias. Thank you so much. So our next speaker is Janetta Candelario, professor in the Department of Sociology and Latin American and Latino Studies and the Study of Women and Gender program affiliate at Smith College. She's the editor of Meridians, Feminism, Race, and Transnationalism, the Meridians Project. The title of her talk will be The Meridians Project, an intersectional feminist scholarship, mentorship, and alternative methods of knowledge production.
Thank you. I'm going to stand so I can take my mask off. Start my own timer so that Nancy doesn't have to. Dame una pelita. So I want to first thank Roberta Villalón for organizing a phenomenal SWS. It's really, truly impressive, along with her compañeras en la lucha, Estel Hernández Medina and Nancy Lopez, my comadres. And I have to really give you guys a round of applause. Can we all just do that? This is, I'm very proud of you. And I'm going to say a little something extra, which is that Nancy Lopez and I have known each other for 30 years officially this year. We went to graduate school together. And as she said in her presentation a couple of days ago, one of our first projects for a conference was work that we did together in a class at the CUNY Graduate Center on Dominican women and welfare. So it's really, truly a pleasure for me to be here today at this table with Nancy. So thank you, Nancy. I also want to say that I'm thrilled to share a conference with Ochi Curiel and Katie Acosta, who are two other Dominican sociologists. And although I am not a nationalist, I'm an anti-nationalist, me siento orgullosa. Okay, so I have to say that. Moving on, I'm here today in my capacity as the editor of the journal Meridians, which I hope most of you have heard about, but if you haven't, I'm gonna take 10 minutes to introduce you to it in hopes that you will submit your work to Meridians, you'll encourage your graduate students to submit work, and that you'll say yes when we ask you to review, because that really is key to the success of any and all publishing project in the United States, for better or for worse. So Meridians was established at Smith College 22 years ago now, this year, with the generous support and funding of our president at the time, Ruth Simmons, who I hope, again, most of you are familiar with. Ruth was the first Black woman president of Smith, the first Black president of Brown University, and she came out of retirement to lead Prairie View University, which is an HBCU in Texas, from which she just recently announced her retirement as well. And it was Ruth's belief in the necessity in 2000, which is when the journal was first published, to center scholarship and knowledge production more broadly understood by and about women of color, not only in the US, but transnationally and globally, around questions of feminism and race and transnationalism. And that vision is what continues to guide us today, although we use slightly different language. As you know, our language evolves. I recently participated last fall in a gathering in Geneva on decolonial feminist publishing that included 24 feminist journal editors from across the world, including folks who zoomed in from Korea and China, people who came from Mexico and zoomed in from Brazil. Some of the journals that our first presenter mentioned, I was really happy to hear them being named here today. And it was about reinstating a commitment and an understanding that, as the earlier presenter said, most journals, most feminist identified journals are in fact located in the US. Makes sense. US is center of global hoarding, right? And resourcing for that. But there are those of us, Meridians being one, that have been decentering that centrality of whiteness, white feminism, and Europeanity and global Northness. So Meridians has always been committed to that project of decolonial feminist knowledge production that is disciplinary, multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and non-disciplinary, and includes creative work, not just conventional scholarship, although we center conventional scholarship because those are the pragmatic needs of our field and institutional context. Our earlier speaker also mentioned Feminist Africa, and I'm really proud to point out that Meridians has been working on a collaboration with Feminist Africa, whose founding editor, Amina Mama, has been on our board for the past 22 years. That is precisely about that kind of decolonial feminist praxis and practice. So just very quickly, a quick history. Meridians has had 4 editors to date. The first was Kumkum Bhavnani, who some of you may know is a sociologist from UCSB, whose work on abolitionism and filmmaking and so forth very much imbued the first 2 issues of the journal. She was followed by Miriam Shansi, who's a scholar at Scripps in Claremont, California, and as you may know, is a Haitian feminist scholar, poet, writer, and researcher who's documented the work of Haitian feminisms. And the longest running editor today, our beloved Paula Giddings, who ran the journal for over 10 years and retired in 2017, handing me the baton. And I have been really pleased to be able to further the work that these previous editors have undertaken. We have a Smith-Duke Editorial Advisory Board because we have been published by Duke University Press since 2018, which is an accomplishment that we're very proud of. The board is comprised, as you see, by an internationally and globally renowned group of feminist scholars. We also have a Creative Writing Advisory Board, whose work it is to help us select an award winner, which I'll get to next. What kind of work do we publish? We publish conventional, research-based scholarship, but we also publish, as I said, knowledge production more broadly understood, testimonio, memoir, creative writing, creative nonfiction, reports from the field of activism, poetry, photo essays, etc. So the idea really is to understand that knowledge is produced in a multiplicity of genres, formats, etc. We have an increasingly rigorous publication rate, which is always a source of ambivalent pride for me, because one of our major agendas is to mentor women of color, feminist scholar, knowledge producers, and feminist scholar knowledge production, which may or may not be the same thing. But we are nonetheless limited to 500 pages per volume, and our submissions are increasing, I'm proud to say. We work really hard to mentor everyone who submits to Meridians, whether or not they end up published. So I want to signal a couple of issues for you. One is that as part of our 20th anniversary celebration, I curated a 500 plus page 20th anniversary reader. I hope every one of you picks this reader up, goes to the DUP Press and considers teaching it in your classes. It covers an incredible range of scholarship, creative writing, etc. from the first 17 years of Meridians. It's a beautiful volume and really showcases not only the history of Meridians and the work it's done, but I would dare say of intersectional feminism over 20 years in the US and transnationally. Recent issues that I want to signal for you are 20, number one, but now that just came out, Transnational Feminist Approaches to Global Anti-Muslim Racisms, which was guest edited by Shireen Razak and Zainab Korkman. And this issue is now available for free through the end of June. As part of Meridian's relationship with DUP, we've been working very hard to ensure that there is not exactly open access, they won't call it that, but there is free access to Meridians, particularly for those outside the academy and the paywall and Project Muse, and particularly for folks in the rest of the world, and especially the Global South. So this issue will be available for free through the end of June. So please, again, spread the word. We want folks to read it, download it, PDF it, circulate it, okay? Yeah. And it covers a really broad range of countries. It's more than half of the pieces are about anti-Muslim racisms outside the US, okay? So very much transnational. The next issue coming out next month or the month after, May, I think, is one that was curated by myself in-house on Black feminisms in the Caribbean and the US. In the fall of 2022, excuse me, we have Feminist Mornings, guest edited by Jyoti Puri and Kimberly Juanita Brown. That will be available by September. BIPOC Europe, guest edited by Nana Osei Kofi and Shirley Ann Tate, coming out in spring of 2023, and Global Indigenous Feminisms, which I am co-guest editing with Bashuli Deb. The call for submissions for that issue is now live, and we're accepting submissions through May 16th. And I want to signal for you that we're especially interested in work focused on New Zealand, Australia, Kenya, the DRC, Somalia, South Africa, Indonesia, India, the Philippines, Palestine, Kashmir, Okinawa, and Ainu. In other words, not just the Western Hemisphere, which is how many of us here tend to think about Indigenous feminism. So again, please do spread the word, and you'll find this call on our website. Just a couple of brief mentions of the fact that since 2018, we have been giving the Paula J. Giddings Best Article Award from each volume. The first one was awarded in the NWSA to Melina Todorova, who wrote about women in post-socialist Europe being influenced by Angela Davis's work. That was followed in 2019 and 2020 by Abosede George on saving Nigerian girls, and Mayli Arvin, whose work on Indigenous feminisms and in Asian migrations clashing in the Hawaiian Islands. That was 2021, was Robert Patterson on the movement for Black Lives, and an honorable mention for Leanne Francis on her work on Black women using the legal system effectively. This year's winner, I'm happy to announce, is Rumia Pucha, whose work, The Mythical Courtesan on Womanhood and Dance in Transnational India. And again, another honorable mention for Evelyn Altusani on how hate crime laws perpetuate anti-Muslim racism. We also have the Elizabeth Alexander Creative Writing Award to acknowledge poets and short story writers, and et cetera. And this year's winner, which was just announced a couple of weeks ago, is Barbara Jane Reyes for her poem, Daughter Song Diaspora, which is a beautiful meditation on diaspora and expulsion. Everyone take out your phone, follow us on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook, please, I mean it, and sign up for our newsletter so that you can stay abreast of our forthcoming issues, our calls for submissions, and our events. We've been doing a great deal of virtual programming, actually. One of the unexpected latent benefits of COVID forcing us out of our real worlds. So truly do follow us and you'll get to know more about what we're doing. Please take a moment to look at our On the Line feature where we do multimedia compliments to every issue, including recordings of authors reading original Arabic text from some of our pieces, a spoken word poetry performance, snippets of the movie that Rumia Pucha was reviewing in her article, etc. And we won an award last year from the Council of Editors of Learned Journals for this feature. It's really useful in the classroom. So again, I want to have you take a moment to go look at it. We've also had Meridians be used by Kay Wise Whitehead and a group of feminist educators in the K through 12 world to teach feminist school teachers, K through 12, how to use Meridian scholarship and intersectionality in their classrooms in an age-appropriate way. And that issue, edited by Kay Wise Whitehead, who's now the president of NWSA, was also awarded by the Exceptional Merit in Media Awards by the Women's Political Caucus. My name is Janetta Candelario. You can reach me at meridians@smith.edu, and I'm happy to answer any questions, if not at the panel, because there's not enough time afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Candelario. So we'll be moving on down and invite Dr. Julie Shane, who's a teaching professor and faculty coordinator of gender, women, and sexuality studies at the School of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences at the University of Washington, Bothell. And the title of her talk is Reflections from a Feminist Editor, Blending Sociological Analysis and Feminist Theory to Create Interdisciplinary Texts and Pedagogy.
Thank you. Okay. No, I think I can do it. Okay, I'll give it to you if I change my mind. So thank you so much, Roberta, for inviting me to be part of this panel. This is very humbling to be part of this group of panelists. And I think it's fitting that we've got Silvana and I went to grad school together as well. So it hasn't been 30 years, but it's getting close. So, and I also wanted to thank Ghassan, even though I'm not sure if he's listening, because his presentation earlier, I think, was a very good precursor to the panel and definitely to what I'm going to say. So the title of my talk probably should be changed. It changed as I worked on it, but that's fine. You'll still follow what's going on. If I can move through the thing. Am I press? Oh, that's the big green button. All right. So I'm going to just basically share briefly my scholarly work that I've done so far, which has been almost entirely interdisciplinary or non-disciplinary. I was thinking I like that better. And with the goal of offering what I think is a good academic approach towards feminist activism and alliances. So I'm going to start with my background in my training, which after I returned to college, after being a Central American Solidarity activist, I went to San Francisco State and did my BA and MA in Women's Studies there. And the slide captures all the stuff that we studied, where I mean, this is why I say non-disciplinary. I think non-disciplinary fits. We didn't even use the word, and it was all Black feminists, women of color feminists, and third world feminist theory, as we called it then. And Angela Davis was there at the time, and Paul Graywall. It was just the bar was raised very high for what feminist theory should be, and just education. So I considered going to get my PhD in women's studies, but it felt, well, there weren't that many choices at the time because it was 1995, but it also felt just too risky. So the next best thing was UCSB in sociology. Kumkum Bhavnani was there, and it that was also really good cultural studies, global studies, and there are several of us here, and a lot of us have talked about, we didn't realize how progressive it was from an interdisciplinary perspective until we left. So that was a great place to be. And my first job out of grad school was at Emory in Atlanta, which was a joint appointment in sociology and women's studies. And I'm from California, and Atlanta is not California. And it was really hard to be there because it's not California or Washington. And we got back, I was in Washington in the Seattle area for a year because of different leaves, maternity and pre-tenure leave, and ultimately resigned because I couldn't go back to Atlanta because I couldn't leave all of that. What you see in the slides, those are just pictures from a cell phone, and just resigned without a job waiting, and extremely good timing, and ended up getting a job at University of Washington Bothell and started part-time, and then have worked my way up the ladder up to full teaching professor. So I left the tenure track, not intentionally or not with a plan, but permanently, and now I'm on the teaching track, which enabled the interdisciplinary even more. So UW Bothell is sort of like a liberal arts R1 type thing. We're one of 3 UW campuses. I'm in the School of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences. We've got about 70 faculty, and I'm one of like 5 sociologists or something. We have 15 majors, and I'm one of the faculty who founded our GWSS, and I'm most involved in GWSS and global studies, and all of my co-faculty we're all over the place, from history of consciousness to complet to econ. I'm just and we barely even know what each other's PhDs are in, because we don't teach in disciplines, we teach non-disciplines, and the students in our classes are all different majors. We work with librarians. It's just extremely enriching. And all of that just changed my publishing. So my first book was, like most people, a monograph dissertation to book, and written for an audience of 4 to 6 tenure reviewers. And it reads like that, and it's very boring, I think. It is, and it's like the disciplinarity or interdisciplinary just got sucked right out of it. So that's fine, though. I was doing well on the tenure track. So after getting off of the tenure track and being in an interdisciplinary space, it was extremely liberating to do my second book, which was about Chilean women, exiles, and feminism. And I was very involved with the cultural studies part of my program at that time, and it very much shines through there. So, but it was still a monograph. But my third book is where when I was editing, that was where the interdisciplinarity really came in, and that's where I was really starting to think about this, the content of this session. And this collection came to be as a result of an interdisciplinary panel. There's 2 sociologists in it, me and Roberta, and it was the thing that holds it together is activist scholarship, Latin American feminism, and our need to be outside of discipline so we could do activist scholarship. And then my most recent collection is where I really pursued interdisciplinarity in every decision that I could. This is fully online, open access, called Persistence is Resistance, Celebrating 50 Years of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies. Thank you. There's 30 scholars, contributors in it. Everybody had to be connected to GWSS, either from training or teaching in GWSS programs. I made a commitment that no more than half of the contributors could be white. The contributions span from poetry to art to more social sciencey, but all of the essays they're almost magazine pieces, like a blend of Ms. Magazine to The Atlantic. So even the social sciencey ones aren't very social sciencey. And I stopped letting sociologists in after a while because there was too many of us, and I didn't want it to be overwhelmed. There's faculty emeritus and undergrads. It's just all over the place, and HBCUs and community colleges, women's colleges, Smith, Carrie Baker's in there. So I'm really happy with the collection. I feel it was really just interdisciplinarity in my most favorite way. So despite me saying, I hope it doesn't sound like I'm just shitting on sociologists, because that's not what I'm trying to get at all right now. I think we have a ton to offer, especially with respect to our methods and the data that we can do in light of just the way that lies have been normalized and gaslighting. Our ability to generate facts are very important right now. Our structural analysis and our clarity is extremely helpful. And I don't want any of that to be lost, but I think that it can be our information can be nuanced significantly when we blend with disciplines. And I think that it can be, we expand our audiences, et cetera, when we do. And one of the ways to do that is through, is to be to organize panels and I do the NWSA a lot and bring in people from different disciplines. If you can co-teach with people outside of your discipline, I know that's a rarity, but it's fantastic if you can do that. Co-authoring, editing books, stuff like that. I think the reason to do that, the other disciplines nuance our strengths. They bring in bigger audiences, obviously, and they make our data sing, especially when you work with humanities and the arts. I mean, our boxes are only so pretty to look at, right? So I think that this is also really matters for our teaching. I mean, we want our students to be able to speak feminism to whoever will listen to them, right? All of our students aren't going to be professors. I hope they aren't all going to be professors. And so we need to be able to teach them in various languages so they can go out and speak it in as many languages. And so we have to do that from an interdisciplinary perspective. So I've worked closely with my librarians to come up with several assignments that basically are more public scholarship focused. And two of these are about archives, and one is a new writing assignment that I've created. That I'll talk about those in the question and answer if people want to hear more, but they're more complicated than 2 minutes worth. But my main takeaways is that we're living in such a misogynist, transphobic, xenophobic shitstorm right now that more than one discipline can handle. I mean, it's really as simple as that. And we need to expand and have as many voices as we can get. So that from a strategic perspective, we need to be interdisciplinary. And from a teaching perspective, we need to train our students to go out into as many places as is possible. So that is where I'm coming from that perspective. So I thank you for listening. And I really also want to encourage those of you with your hands in journals, including Gender and Society, to review my book, not just for myself, but for junior scholars who are trying to pursue open access publications and interdisciplinary publications to legitimize this as a normal publication, because it's risky to do this sort of stuff if you're junior. I mean, I keep joking that I'm at the no shits left to give rank, and I can do what I want right now as teaching professor on the teaching track. But if you're junior, you can't fool around with this sort of stuff. But if we can legitimize it by getting it reviewed in top journals like Gender and Society, then junior faculty can take these risks as well, and they'll stop being risks after a while.
Thanks so much. So next we have a co-presentation. Dr. Julie Shane.
No, that was
I'm
mine.
sorry, Dr. Janet Conway, Professor of the Department of Sociology at Brock University, and Dr. Natalie Lebron, Associate Professor and Chair of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Gettysburg College. And they're the co-editors of the Latin American Perspectives issue on popular feminisms, past, present, and futures. And their remarks are going to talk about producing knowledge for feminism and feminist knowledge, studying subaltern feminisms.
Hello, everybody, and thank you very much to Roberta for the invitation. This gives us an opportunity to think more self-consciously about the centrality of inter-trans, non-disciplinarity for feminist knowledge production, and also for our own transdisciplinary praxis in the context of this special issue on popular feminisms. So in the time we have, we're going to try to describe the transdisciplinary character of this project and the multidisciplinary assemblage of contributors, questions, and approaches that gathered together, how we worked with this assemblage, how this stretched us and them, and our understanding of what the hell we were doing. And finally, we'll offer some takeaways on interdisciplinarity in feminist knowledge production. So in brief, the project. So popular feminism as a concept in feminist scholarship and political praxis was born in Latin America in the 1970s and 80s as a way of naming the gendered agency among women of the so-called popular sectors. So popular in this context means of the people, meaning the poor, economically and socially marginalized majority, the popular classes. So it means something different in a Latin American and in Spanish and Portuguese context than it does in North America. So in this context, we're talking concretely of residents of urban shanty towns and rural villages who are on the margins of modern society. And in the 70s and 80s, these were poor women who were organizing collectively in the context of deep economic crisis and a crisis of livelihood. And they were organizing for food and water to feed their children, very, very literally to feed their families and to keep them alive. And also in the context of dictatorship, organizing collectively to protest the disappearance of their children. So popular in this sense, as I said, refers to this economically and socially marginalized position, which some also equate with the language of class or the working class. We are ambivalent about that, and we tend to use more the language of subaltern or subalternized as a way of understanding what popular means in this context. Most of these grassroots women, so again, grassroots, we're using this as a shorthand in English to try to signify what popular means in Spanish and Portuguese. Many of these grassroots women were housewives. They did not self-identify as feminist, but over the course of organizing collectively as women over a number of decades, they did come to, many came to identify themselves as feminist. Also because self-identified feminists did work with them. And over time, these poor women did come to identify as feminist and to protest against gendered violence and for sexual and reproductive rights, and to make a claim on feminism. And there's a long history of tension between these popular women's movements and so-called mainstream feminism in Latin America. So popular feminism as a category also needs to be understood in the context of mass popular movements of the time for democratic rights and for social and often socialist transformation. So invoking the notion of the popular and of popular struggle also carried this sense of emancipatory politics and emancipatory potential. Now, what was curious to us is that the term popular feminism as a category and also as a category of feminist practice largely disappeared in the 1990s. But in our studies of the World March of Women, which is this transnational feminist network, we actually saw the reappearance of a discourse of popular feminism in the 2010s. And this set up our agenda for this special issue. And so our questions were, what happened to this praxis of grassroots or popular feminism in this interim between 1990 and 2010? What was its relationship in the past and in the present to Black and Indigenous feminisms that had gained visibility in the 1990s and the abeyance of popular feminism? Popular feminism is and remains a racially unmarked category, even though the popular sectors in many places were and are composed of racialized people. Was the term popular feminism a quasi-universal category like class that occluded Black and Indigenous difference within the popular sectors, even as it tried to get at the gendered agency of poor, rural, and working class women who are often themselves racialized? Question. Relatedly, in its valorization of women's gender roles and gendered divisions of labor, did it reinscribe heteronormativity, cisnormativity, and the gender binary? Question. And if it was such a universal category and problematic in all these ways that feminism has spent a lot of time talking about over the last few decades, how do we assess its reappearance in the 2010s in a transnational feminist network, the largest in the world, like the World March of Women, with a prominent presence across Latin America? So in the call for papers, we invited new consideration of popular feminism, grounded in changing material and discursive conditions, informed by anti-racism and critical race theory, indigenisms, decolonial feminism, LGBT and queer theory, along with socialist, materialist, and gender class feminism. We invited historically and contextually sensitive studies, including those that might be comparative or transnational across the Latin American region. And finally, we invited studies that were politically attuned to the dilemmas of progressive social transformation. The journal that we chose, Latin American Perspectives, that's another story, which we're happy to talk about the war stories over that in the Q&A. But the good thing about it is that it's a multilingual journal. So we invited contributions in English, Spanish, or Portuguese. Latin American Perspectives is itself an multi-transdisciplinary journal that's actually historically very driven by the political needs of the left and the array of left movements. So it made it a good choice in some ways, although a very difficult choice as feminists working in that context. And we can say more about that. So in the context of this discussion of interdisciplinarity, the point here is to say that our project here was driven by a political and analytic problematic. It was a problem for feminist political practice and for our understanding of this practice, not arising from disciplinary debates. So as others have said, it really arose from that kind of political problem and our analytic problem related to it. So it arose from social movement praxis that we were studying, and it also took shape within our own intellectual trajectories. So now a word on just my own intellectual trajectory. My academic formation actually originated in the humanities. So history, English, religious studies, theology, and I'm not done yet. During that time, I actually became politicized as a feminist and stepped out of the academy, became a full-time activist in feminist and anti-poverty movements in Toronto, moved into the anti-globalization movement. And what's very important about that is that that political formation for me is at least as important as my academic formation in terms of shaping my academic work. And so to me, in terms of talking about interdisciplinarity and how it shapes work, to me, that political formation, that activist formation is a huge other and just I can't minimize the importance of that. So after a decade in those activist spaces, I undertook a PhD at this time in political science. So I'm on discipline number, 5 now. I eventually landed in a sociology department without ever having taken the course in sociology, by the way, as a Canada Research Chair in social justice, a great interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, non-disciplinary job studying transnational social justice movements. So all this is to say that my intellectual and activist political formation oriented me to the problems of social movements and social change that absolutely could not be productively contained by any single field or discipline.
Mine's going to be a little shorter. I mean, my biography or my political formation. So I was trained first in languages and in political science with an MA in political science, and my PhD is in anthropology. But I chose my PhD program for its strength in feminist studies and in Latin American studies. And really, Latin American studies is my intellectual home, and area studies, I think, are fundamentally interdisciplinary, as I will discuss in a minute. But it's also true that my interest in social movements also led me towards other disciplines like political sociology, history, and Black studies. So now I'm going to focus on detailing in what ways our double issue is transdisciplinary. So the first point is maybe a bit predictable. It's the way in which it draws on a wide range of scholarly expertise from different disciplines. So each contributor is themselves a transdisciplinary scholar with their own mix of disciplinary training. But more importantly, their focus is on a particular problematic, right? So they kind of take a deep dive, a holistic dive into a particular problematic, not hindered by disciplinary frameworks. And drawing on this wide range of expertise across disciplines was particularly important for us as we were studying, or we were interested in understanding more about popular feminism. And that's because popular feminisms are organized around a very broad range of problematics, right? Many of which are not often included in hegemonic forms of feminism. So here I can give you a snapshot of what's in the double issue. Here we have contributions on response to police violence by Afro-descendant women in Rio de Janeiro's favelas. We have response to displacement due to armed conflict in Colombia, the theorizing of the role and place of indigenous women in the Zapatista counterinsurgency in Mexico. Another chapter explores how organizations in the Cauca region in Colombia respond to the structural violence of settler colonialism. As you would expect, intimate partner violence also does figure as a problematic in these chapters, in some of these chapters. Another line of interest is material access to material resources that counts, that's very important for popular feminism. So our authors analyzed in different settings, survival struggles, access to land, access to water, to public services and urban infrastructure, grassroots economic organizing in response to rural poverty. Of course, labor and care work were always figuring prominently in some of these contributions as well, as you can expect, right? So the second way in which transdisciplinarity is crucial to this project is that we need to understand the place from which popular feminisms emerge and evolve, right? We wanted to avoid wrong-headed generalizations about any forms of feminism. And so analysis of any particular instantiation of popular feminism needed to be strongly grounded in that specificity of this particular place, of its context, right? And that's also needs to be approached transdisciplinarily. So it is not any coincidence that our authors are Latin Americanist, most of them. They're area studies scholars, right? And they offer a rich contextual analysis of feminist practices in these specific national, subnational cultures and societies, as well as in local contexts. I, for example, have been working with some of the same groups in Brazil for more than 20 years. So just give you an example. So each place needs to be understood in this thick, multi-layered historical, sociological, political, and cultural way. I mean, it requires deep, in-depth knowledge about any particular place, its politics, its history, its social movements. And so area studies do help provide this transdisciplinary holistic approach to place and therefore to social movements. But what we needed for us as we were building the collection were a collection of these thick descriptions, right, of these particular places and variety of forms of popular feminism, so that we could try and firm up what the meaning of the concept of popular feminism itself meant, and how we wanted to ground the theory into these specific instantiations, right? The third way in which our issue is transdisciplinary is the way in which our focus was on the call for paper, as Janet mentioned, right? That is on the concept of popular feminism itself and the politics of intersectionality and coloniality with it, right? So disciplinary preoccupations were not at all considered, in terms of selection of the contributions, in terms of our later interactions with our authors. These were sustained interactions with revised versions of paper going 3 or 4 times between them and us. I mean, it was a lot of work, very intense work. We tend to push our authors to think about important debates in feminist scholarship and activism around the concerns that I've just mentioned before. We really wanted them to interact with these key aspects. And we also wanted them to anchor their responses in what they observed, right? In observable social practices. So in practice, that meant we kept pulling them back to work to conceptualize popular feminism. We encourage them to read more of the feminist literature about popular feminism. We kept asking them to specify whether grassroots women actually did use this term, how were they using it? Did they self-identify this way, right? In a second way, we also, in a second point, we also encouraged authors to be clear about the class and the racial composition of the actors in these concepts, in these contexts. So in terms of class, we asked authors to be explicit about how they used class, not to use class as a black box. In particular, we asked them, what does working class mean to your analysis, or in your analysis, what does it mean to the groups that you're working with? Are all members of this popular feminist organization you work with really working class, or are there middle class allies involved? And then what are the relations between these different groups? In terms of politics of race and whiteness, we asked whether there were women of African descent and indigenous women present in these organizations, whether racism and the politics of race were discussed, keeping in mind the generally race-blind tenor of Latin American national identities that others have noted about. And what about, we were asking them to think about the power dynamics within the organization itself, and of course, in these organizations' frameworks and praxis, right? So ultimately, we really wanted to find out from these authors whether the concept of popular feminism was still relevant, whether it was problematic, was it a colonial concept? Is it a race-blind concept that contributes to women's race problem? Is it heteronormative, right? And our authors did confirm the often race-blind connotations of the concept of popular feminism and highlighted the need to name the specificity of community-based racialized women's organizing in concepts such as racialized popular feminism, decolonial popular feminism. But they also spoke back to us in ways that we did not expect or did not anticipate. They revealed a reframing by decolonial and racialized popular feminists of some core popular feminist concepts, such as home place, motherhood, and reproductive labor and care. So briefly, home place is now a site of survival and resistance, a place of healing. And in other words, we hope to have shown that they have greatly destabilized common understandings of the concept of popular feminism.
Okay, so in my last 30 seconds, our takeaways, our work was problem focused, not disciplinary focused. It suggests a real relationship between inter and transdisciplinarity and the need for collaboration, the fact that we cannot be experts in all discourses, and the need to create cultures of conversation and collaboration requires an openness to follow, as somebody else, I think Blue said, an openness to follow the problem wherever it will lead you, and to bring resources to bear that you need. But it also, I think we would say, it requires a certain fluency in the vocabulary of multiple disciplines, because people are still working within certain traditions, and that fluency and an openness to dialogue across those kinds of disciplinary differences, and also open-endedness in terms of findings, so that the lines of interpretation are varied and plural and are not all they don't all interact smoothly, or it doesn't all fit so smoothly together. And finally, the relationship between inter and transdisciplinarity with internationalism and multilingualism in feminist scholarship. And so we know that, as others have said, that publication venues are still so organized around, and conferences as well, organized around disciplinary conventions and boundaries. And, in the finest traditions of feminist studies, we need to keep protesting this and pushing against it. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Appreciate that. And I know we have Professor Silvana Falcon, Associate Professor of Latin American and Latino Studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And her remarks are going to talk about respecting research, emotions, and feelings, embracing feminist wisdom.
Thank you, Nancy. Okay, well, I want to add my voice of deep affection, admiration, and love to the SWS Planning Committee, to Roberta, to Barrett, to Natasha, to all the staff who worked here at this beautiful place, to have had this conference derailed, to then offer it in this hybrid format. I mean, wow. I remember when it got canceled, my heart sank because I just knew all of this extra work was going to have to go into creating this like second part 2 version of the conference. And I think we're grateful for their feminist commitment to bringing us together. We're very grateful for you and thank you so much. Well, if there was ever a time for feminist theory, feminist sociology, and feminist politics, I think the universe is telling us the time is now. When Roberta, the wonderful Roberta, invited me to be on the panel, I thought, how generous, how amazing. And then I thought, oh, geez, what am I going to talk about, especially with such esteemed panelists? And I thought, well, I want to talk about feelings and its relationship to research. And I want to talk about feelings because something has been unleashed these past several years in which we don't really have the words to describe it. And so let me explain what I mean by this. In 2016, many of us probably in this room traveled to Montreal to the National Women's Studies Association annual conference. The conference theme was decoloniality. This was 48 hours after the US election results. And so everyone was in a bit of a daze in Montreal. Is this really happening? Did he really just get elected to be the next US president? And then this feeling of knowing that things were really not going to be okay in the US and in the world, but not quite sure yet in what way or how. I won the NWSA Book Award that year, the Gloria Anzaldúa Book Award. Thank you. This had been my dream book award. No offense to the ASA Book Awards, but this is the book award, the Anzaldúa Book Award. That was my dream. And I tell you, I cannot remember anything about that moment. This career highlight that I can only recall from an out of focus picture that someone thankfully managed to take of me on stage. But that was the energy for all of us at that conference, walking around like zombies, deep grief, deep fear, deep sadness. One of the few things I do remember about the 2016 WSA conference was a session in which Maria Lugones was in the audience. As we tried to convey and express how we were feeling, Maria, who was sitting to my left, and I remember this very vividly, just says, no words, with her hand, no words. And she said, and I'm not gonna do a direct quote because it was too beautiful in the way she framed it, but in essence, she was saying, you're searching for words, feelings in which no words exist. So stop searching for the words. There are no words. And that stayed with me because we remain in a no words time. This continuation of the no words time that Lugones called out in 2016. And if there are no words, and if we are in a no words time, then how do we move forward since we have a yes words all of the time profession? What does no words time mean for us as intellectuals, as writers, as activists, when we are living during a time in which we don't have the words because there are none? Let me tell you, I'm not sure what it means to be living in a no words world, but I know if we have any chance of making sense of some of it, then we have to approach it from an interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary or non-disciplinary, thank you for that framing, way. We have to look beyond the academy. The SWS conference title, as we know, Rethinking Feminist Sociologies in the Era of Global Pandemics. That rethinking part has to apply to our research practices. And for this panel in particular requires a rethinking about the approaches we're taking, the methods we're using, the questions we're asking, whom we are reading and in what language, and our sense of time has to be seriously interrogated. So let me explain a bit further what I do know and what I can put into words as food for thought in rethinking the future of feminist sociology and engaging with inter or transdisciplinary type of research. Of course, as sort of a caveat, disclaimer, I'm going to say, goes against the structures of the academy, and we can talk about that more broadly in the Q&A, but I think these are still important points to consider in this particular space. Number one, we are exhausted. You're all looking at me like, yeah, no kidding. But what does this mean for feminist sociological research to be exhausted? It means we may actually have to slow down. It means we can't pretend that we can carry out research in some pre-pandemic imagination. Everything has changed. So rethinking feminist sociology means redesigning your research by acknowledging the exhaustion and knowing that everything will take possibly twice as long at least. When you're exhausted, you make mistakes in the research process as well. And so a redesign meaning maybe your interviews are not as long, maybe you do less interviews, maybe you rely more on secondary data. You're exhausted, and so are the people you are interacting with. You're doing ethnography or other types of qualitative research. So how do we redesign research that is not further exhaust you or your research collaborators? I think this is the question we have to ask ourselves. Maybe now is the time to engage with fiction or other literary works in crafting a feminist sociological imagination. Maybe we engage with archives or for further insights into the political subjects that we're exploring. So maybe there's a space to see what already exists that can be accessed without having to collect new data on our own or with our research team. Any kind of shift in this way requires an engagement with fields and disciplines outside of sociology and outside of the academy in general. It bears noting our exhaustion is not the same, clearly. I take to heart the words of the panelists from this morning's amazing plenary about the constant state of chaos that exists in the world pre-COVID, and it's disproportionately experienced by marginalized communities. And that COVID was just one more series of chaoses introduced into their or our lives. But the disruption of social life, perhaps those small joys we had in our day-to-day, maybe saying hello to our neighbor, saying hello to someone on the bus, some random act of kindness. Those small joys were taken away from us, including from marginalized communities who perhaps relied on those small joys in the midst of so much global chaos. The other point that I want to raise is that our insistence on being resilient can result in ignoring pain or refusing to acknowledge the pain we may be seeing as part of our research. Let's just be clear, being resilient is exhausting, right? It's and this term has been been sort of used a lot amongst administrators. When we describe people's ability to survive as being resilient, we may miss the precarity that is there when we rely on a resiliency framing to describe survival. Because in stating that people are doing okay despite all of the havoc that's been unleashed, we may miss the ways in which they or we are not okay, right? Everyone has their limits. The three questions I included in my abstract for this talk are these. How do we remain open to those feelings and acknowledge those emotions and even honor them in order to enrich our intellectual work? How can they guide us in making decisions about the research itself? How do we bring our whole complicated selves into the research process and draw on interdisciplinarity as central to feminist work? I think a place to start in answering those questions requires us to acknowledge the exhaustion without judging it, acknowledge the heartache and loss by honoring it, recognizing that these emotions actually make us better researchers, feminist researchers, and that being resilient comes at a cost. And so if it comes at a cost, then how can we be gentle on ourselves and each other, in which we can still engage in our research at a different pace, with different methodologies, with different feminist approaches? By engaging feminist research practices, then we may need to revisit how we did research before and consider how that does not work for us now. In other words, it's time to be very honest about our capacity. If we can approach this moment as a reset, let's enter this time with our entire hearts, minds, and beings. Even though we may not have the words, as Lagona said back in 2016, we do have emotions and feelings that can serve as our research guide, as our ethical compass, and really push the boundaries of sociology to be better engaged with the social energy and dynamics of the world. That boundary pushing must happen by bringing our whole selves into the research process, not as fragments. It means we must get outside of a confined discipline in which we take risks to engage other forms of knowledge. And so I want to close with this short poem. I actually grabbed the book by young Pablo Inward as I literally was heading out the door, and I don't know what was drawing me to pull the book, but something was. So I grabbed the book as I was heading out to the car to go to the airport. And I want to close by reading this poem. And this is in the section called Understanding. And I just want to offer it to you because it was actually the first page I opened up. I mean, this is the universe, right? Like I opened the book and I'm like, oh yeah, this is exactly what I would like to share as a close to my talk. Healing yourself will ask more of you. More rest, more self-love, more letting go, more time for learning, more space for transformation, more honesty about how you feel, more time developing good habits, more courage to try new practices, more faith in yourself and the process, more time cultivating your inner peace. Thank you.
Gracias. So our next presenter is actually my colega, Dr. Francisco Gallarte, Assistant Professor in the Department of American Studies and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at the University of New Mexico, and also the editor of the Transgender Studies Quarterly. And the remarks are going to be about thinking race, sex, and trans feminism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for the wonderful invitation to be a part of this phenomenal panel this afternoon. And, please bear with me as I've kind of decided to take my comments elsewhere. I think originally I was going to reflect on a paper that I gave about 10 years ago now at the conference Mujeres Activas en Letras en Cambio Social in 2011, where I was asked to speak on trans inclusion, as that particular organization was beginning to discuss what it might mean to include trans men and trans women within the work that MOX was doing. And for me, that was a really formative moment, just because I had recently transitioned, but also was doing work in transgender studies and was someone who clung very fiercely to Chicana feminism as the framework through which I was understanding trans embodiment and politics, and also really mourning what it might be to kind of lose a proximity to the Chicana feminist in my life, as I was beginning to kind of see how there was particular investments in essentialisms that I just wasn't reading in the text, either because I didn't want to, or I just wasn't attuned to reading for that in the way that I was encountering those texts at the time. But with what happened this week in Arizona and kind of the ongoing onslaught on trans folks in the US, I kind of changed course and decided to focus in on a way that I'm trying to make sense of what's happening with these recent legislations, which make sense. They're not a surprise, but the idea that Governor Doug Ducey is going to sign this right before Trans Day of Visibility just kind of set me over the edge. So I'm going to read a little bit from some work and some ideas that I'm thinking through. And as someone who's not a sociologist or was not trained in sociology, I do want to say that I have a very concerted interest in kind of revisiting the horrible legacy of early sociologists and kind of mining what observations were made, especially about Mexican Americans and Mexican American children in the 1920s and 30s. And so some of this framing is going to come from that work. And I'm going to pair that with a little bit of personal memory, personal memoir in relationship to some of the ideas I'm trying to suss out here. So in 1932, sociologist Ruth Shawn Lee Kavan published an essay in the American Journal of Sociology entitled "A Wish to Never Have Been Born." In this essay, Kavan ruminates on juvenile suicide. In the essay, Kavan differentiates between wishes for death as opposed to suicide. Kavan's data was collected from questionnaires filled out by 9,000 junior high school students across the US in 1928. The questionnaire circulated as part of a study commissioned by President Hoover's White House Conference on Child Health and Protection. This questionnaire was included a brief list of neurotic traits to measure, quote, neurotic tendencies. The question from which Kavan derives her title is, "Did you ever wish you had not been born?" Of interest to me and not explored in Kavan's essay is that in the survey, Mexican children had the highest percentage, 35%, of those who responded they wish they had not been born. The majority of students in this study were located in San Diego, California. Kavan chooses to provide a detailed analysis of one group in the study, which she describes as, quote, urban white children with native-born fathers, end quote. According to Kavan, the wish to never been born among children is something that we must accept at face value as a, quote, wish on the part of the child that he had not been called upon to accept the responsibilities of living, end quote. The contrast that is posed by Kavan between a wish to die and a wish to accept the responsibilities of living feels provocative to me for many reasons. It feels like a refusal and need to not culminate in suicide, but surely for Black and Mexican children included in the data set living in the US, they may very likely, this wish or this refusal very likely may have culminated in premature death at the hands of state violence, poverty, or military service. Of interest for me here is the refusal conjured by Kavan, or at least how I choose to read this refusal undertaken by these children. It reminds me of myself, of the choices I made as a young child. So I hope you will indulge me as I share a short portion of my own childhood history. Up until I was about 17 years old, I lived in a small town called Brawley, which is located in the Imperial Valley in California's Imperial County. This Imperial Valley is rural and smack between the Salton Sea and the US-Mexico border. The largest city, urban city, is Mexicali in Mexico. The economy in that area had always been largely agriculturally driven, and this is what attracted my grandparents on both sides of my family to settle there. My parents, siblings, and I all attended the same elementary schools. There's only one middle school, so we all went there, and only one high school, so we only went there. And to be someone who's growing up working class in what was a very segregated town in the time that even when I lived there and was a child in the 1980s, felt very overwhelming. But one of the moments of repose that I had was always school. As a child, I loved to read, and I learned this from my father, who always had a book in his hand. And in that moment of being from a small town and living through this kind of place where I was trying to make sense of my own embodiment and desires, and not so much a incongruence of the gender that I was born, but rather I struggled to understand the life that I was living, or maybe not wanting to take hold of or live in the body that I moved through at the time, and with most of my childhood. So in second grade, I had a young teacher. It was the first time I had had a young teacher. It's only the third teacher I'd had, mind you, but I was surprised to not have a middle-aged woman as my school teacher. And for some reason, that her youthfulness made me feel like I could confide in her in ways that I could not in my family home. So all of second grade, what I remember most is that I didn't go to recess and I cried almost every single day. And this teacher just let me cry. And in that time, she tried very hard to figure out what it was that I was crying about. And in my second grade, 7-year-old mind, all that I could say is that, my mother was making me cry. And now, with the distance that I have, I know that the struggles that my 7-year-old self had with my mother was me not being able to have the words to have her understand the way that I was making sense of the life that I was given, because she had given me this life, and otherwise I had no other reason to, cry or to have conflict with her. So, there wasn't abuse and there wasn't violence in my particular context, but my very well-meaning school teacher read this particular, my particular description of, fighting as maybe a moment of child abuse that was occurring in my family home. So what that caused for me is that with this teacher, she allowed me to go by a name that I understood to be a masculine name. So for most of second grade, I was being named through a name that I felt aligned with, how I understood myself and the life that I wanted to build as more masculine and as a man. And so the moment in which my teacher decided to report my mother really fundamentally shook my survival within a context in which I was teased for various other reasons, not related to my gender, but also, removed me from a space where I could just cry. I didn't cry at home when I was trying to make my mother understand how I was experiencing my gender. But she did see glimpses of what that was through the work I produced with my second grade teacher's class. That year, I wrote maybe what I might consider an epic narrative about being an astronaut, where I was drawing myself in the way that I saw myself, and also live my life being, flagged in that particular way. And so as I think about, how to make sense of anti-trans legislation and the attack on trans children, many of my colleagues in transgender studies have want us to understand the figure of the trans child as a white trans child. If we look at the legislations, we can see and understand that part of the discourse is that, folks who are under 18 should be able to retain their ability to reproduce, or retain that capacity to reproduce within their bodies. And so from what we know from various sociological texts and historical studies, is there's been a concerted effort to prevent racialized individuals from reproducing. So what this means to me is that these attacks more so are legislating the premature death of many trans children. So in my case, the refusal of the life, right, of having a wish to never have been born, but not necessarily having a wish to die. I think that these trans legislations in relationship to racialized trans children who are also living in that borderlands where they can access discourse around trans materials and trans care, right? But have a familial life in which their parents are overburdened by poverty, by racial structures, by all of the demands of what force a premature life. There is a way in which there is a misunderstanding, right? Where there is a disjuncture, where a kind of wish to never have been born, or the refusal to live the life that you were born into, or the future that is scripted to you, becomes both a glimmer of possibility, but both a place through which I seek to understand the figure of the racialized child in relationship to the body, embodiment, and of course, the surveillance of reproductive capacity as it relates to Mexican-American women. So, if you bear with me, these are just gestures and kind of places that I wanted to begin to think through and push us a little bit further than kind of what I understand to be the easy way to think about these legislations, in the sense that trans is so recent, but rather have us think about embodiment in different types of ways historically in the management of racialized families. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And so we have two more speakers left. And we will invite Dr. PJ DiPietro, Director of Undergraduate Studies, Assistant Professor in the Department of Women and Gender Studies Affiliate in Native American and Indigenous Studies, as well as Latin American Studies, LGBT Studies program at Syracuse, and co-editor of Speaking Face to Face, The Visionary Philosophy of Maria Lugones, Ungendering Feminism on Maria Lugones' Decolonial Praxis. And I have to add that both Dr. Candelario and I participated in some of her convergence spaces here in Nuevo Mexico over La Escuela Popular Norteña decades ago, and we were just transformed by that. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't know if you noticed that the 4 Latinx people in the panel stood up to talk. Isn't that nice? It's interesting, right? Right. So thank you to President Roberta Villalon and the organizing committee for both the invitation and for making this magnificent event possible. I turn to my presentation right away to stay close to the time limit. And what do I press here? Beautiful. Lugones' lifelong pilgrimage makes sense of resistant possibilities. It makes connections between two key ideas in her framework. On the one hand, the theorizing of multiple oppressions, what oppressions mean, how they operate, and the ways that an oppressive social hides the heterogeneity of and among oppressions. On the other hand, the theorizing of body-to-body engagements, of the matter of subjectivity, of its production across and beyond the modern colonial individual self. Lugones theorizes the materiality of subjects as emerging from the I, moving toward we, resisting and committing themselves to worlds where hegemonies lose their grip. In my view, the manyness of oppression and resistance subject formation are tied together conceptually and practically speaking. In playfulness, world traveling, and loving perception, Lugones invokes the I moving toward we through the social production of the mother-daughter relation. While at times the pilgrimage emphasizes the I, she examines the competence of world travelers as dispersed selves. They are selves that exist, but across more than one world, across the many relationalities in line with and against the many guises of power. She inhabits the relation with her mother through the exigencies of the divide between productive and reproductive labor. In the relationality of arrogant perception of the self who exists through the appropriation of the mother's substance, Lugones learns the habits of thingification. Neither husband nor children truly pay attention to the wife mother other than through the relationality of needs. Arrogant perceivers rehearse love as a relation of exploitation and reduction. In such world, Lugones and her mother registers the unloving contradictions of love. Lugones is not at ease in a world where she must identify her mother as the recipient of arrogant perception. Lugones faces the social-cultural roots of arrogant perception and their shaping of motherly and female self-abnegation within Argentina's whitened and middle class. To love her mother in this fashion means that Lugones learns to prepare herself to service patriarchy. What a great decolonial feminist lesson about the non-normative erotics, the non-normative ethics between mother and daughter, right? In her theory of the flesh, I should add as a side note, Cherie Moraga captures a kindred disposition in the relationship with her mother. As Lugones navigates the contradiction of oppressive loving habits, she develops a significant maxim of decolonial feminism. Oppression is not a done deal. She sees the heterogeneity of patriarchal oppression, of gendering, in the links between her mother's reduction and her arrogant perceiving as daughter. The ontology of oppression conveys that it remains open. Maybe you get to see some of the contributions to a sociological thinking here. The ontology of gendering thus entangles the simultaneous process of ungendering. This is a realization that Lugones pursues more emphatically by the first decade of this century. Partially, I think about ungendering as a logical consequence of Lugones' account of resistance. Her mother enacts resistance that goes unrecognized, at least in the sense that it does not override the patriarchal ordering of the middle class in Argentina. For its orientation, which leans sideways and often away from public and counter-public meaning, resistance encodes first and foremost the dispersed sociality of the I moving toward we, both mother and daughter, and yet neither one nor the other, both being gendered as an oppressing that remains open, incomplete, and engaging, ungendering as ongoing resistance to multiple oppressions. This I moving toward we more fully makes vivid the social vacuum that pushes against the reduction of mother and daughter by arrogant perceivers. Here it lies what Lugones describes as an ontological pluralism that is true to experience, that is gendering and ungendering, both and more than two in their manyness. Not loving her mother returns Lugones to an experience of dizzying realities. She coins the neologism, quote, oppressing, being oppressed, resisting, to capture the mutual implication of fragmentation and multiplicity. Failing to love her mother points to the dispersal of intentions because it conveys that the daughter finds some social backing to withdraw from the worlds where she's constructed as reprehensible, someone who doesn't love their mother. Traveling across these worlds gives rise to the many embodied ways through which the daughter, failing to identify with and thus love her mother, commits herself to realities where arrogant perception may not fully gender her mother. So far, you may hear me saying something that goes like this. Lugones states that the gendering of both mother and daughter follows arrogant perception. She also states that she cannot love her mother in the world where Lugones fails to identify with arrogant perception. However, this could give way to a binary, flattening understanding of oppression and resistance, of gendering and ungendering, to an understanding way too reliant on the fiction that the I follows or the I cannot love. Rather, Lugones advances a pluralist and true to experience account of gendering and ungendering. Let's illustrate the inner works of this pluralist socio-spatial situation. In the introduction to Pilgrimages Peregrinajes, Lugones claims that her mother used to ask for things by saying, quote, "It is on that thing next to that thing over there with the other things." And then Lugones adds that if you were not in the habits of following her mother's moves, of her subordination through cooking, cleaning, and facilitating the life of her children and husband, no one could have gotten her mother the things she was asking for. Clearly, Lugones' ontological pluralism begins with the deconstruction of the privileges that arrogant perception affords. Lugones also means to convey the active subjectivity of her mother, who, not quite at ease with the practice of denouncing out loud the harms of patriarchy, managed to make herself important through other means, perhaps more important to others, but most pointedly to herself, by or through veiling the lack of reciprocity that she faced every day. According to Lugones, her mother makes herself the pivotal directional subject. She veils the lack of reciprocity within white supremacist patriarchy by making the things that populate the family's world only visible to her and invisible to her husband and children, unless, of course, you get to travel to her world. It is paradoxical that the mother could become the durational subject, since the patriarchal world renders the mother invisible. So how is it possible? We may ask, I'm almost there, we may ask, where does the directionality of the invisible subject arise from? Does ungendering arise from the subject herself? Lugones claims that the individual is a modern colonial fiction. Thus, ungendering does not arise from the individual. Lugones, I would like to argue, draws our attention to what she calls the inner works, the logics of social spatial situations in her account of the emergence of resistant intentions. She explicates the inner works through the dissonance between being both playful and not playful across different worlds. What is at stake is her critique of mindness, which is a notion that Eurocenter phenomenology employs to designate an existential togetherness that remembers how the I fares in this or that world. The notion of inner works instead points to ontological pluralism, to the realities of subjects whose condition lies outside existential togetherness. What would be a sociology of a lack of existential togetherness? For example, and I'm going to end with this. For example, proponents of intersectional thinking also theorize the social spatial situation of women of color who experience themselves both as an absence and as a site that, according to Kimberly Crenshaw, resist telling. Indeed, Lugones examines the significance of dissonance for the social backing of oppositional logics. For example, the logic of ungendering mother and daughter, the I moving toward we of ungenderly or ungendering gingerly insinuate themselves in the search for resistant company. Through world traveling, plural selves become less reliant on individual offering. And I had another page, but this is where I'm going to leave it. Thank you so very much.
Mil gracias. So now we have our last speaker, and that is Dr. Jennifer McWeeny, who will be joining us via Zoom, Associate Professor of Philosophy in the Humanities and Arts Department at Worcester Polytechnic Institute and co-editor of Speaking Face to Face, the visionary philosophy of, of Maria Lugones, the first person experience, a decolonial method.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here. I've been so much enjoying the panel tonight and all the other wonderful presenters. Thank you to Roberta and thank you for the audience. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great. And also, consistent with the theme of the conference, I'm been very sick for 2 weeks with the pandemic, and this is the first day I'm speaking and up, so please bear with my voice here. Okay, so I want to talk about what I learned from Marie Lugones in terms of reading all of her work, studying all of her work, speaking with her students and friends, and a few things that I've learned from Marie Lugones. And for Lugones, method is so important. When you read her essays, she's thinking about, how do I do something? How do I move through this thought? Whom am I speaking to? Why am I writing this? And she really doesn't just dive in, she just takes time to, it's methodical and working through these methods. Marie Lugones was the first person really who taught me to resist being disciplined by the discipline of philosophy, and also taught me that instead of leaving the discipline or only doing interdisciplinary work, that I can also use the discipline in the service of resistance in ways as well. So I want to highlight 3 things from a wonderful essay, 2012 essay of Lugones's methodological notes for decolonial feminism. So one of the first things that she talks about is investigate the concrete as a method. I'm investigating historically and in contemporary living, concrete lived resistances to the coloniality of gender that issue from this tension at the colonial difference. She also talks about honoring the local. I'm moving to a way of speaking in decolonial feminism that seeks coalitions among the colonized across vast history spaces, since always honoring the local, since resistance can be seen and understood only up close. And the third thing I want to highlight, methodological thing, is to learn to read each other's resistances and also our own. And reading each other's resistances at the conflict between being subjectified, turned into a certain kind of subject, and resisting that through active subjectivity. So Maria Lugones really helped me to, when I was young and just starting off in philosophy as a student, to really position myself in relation to others and to see myself as located in the academy, and also to see philosophy, which is purportedly about theorizing the universal, as extremely located, deeply located, and particular. So at the time I was studying Indian philosophy at the University of Hawaii, and I was reading Indian feminists, and I was reading Chicana and Latina feminists, and Marie Lugones helped me think of myself as an American Irish woman who grew up in a very tight Irish American community in Boston, Massachusetts, and think about how I'm forming coalitions and also maybe failing at forming coalitions with Indian women and Chicana and Latino women as well. And so I started to read everything I could about sort of the traditional things about Irish American racialization. And I found that in a lot of these texts, there was no first person experience mentioned, and certainly not first person experience of Irish American women and what it's like to, the questions that I've been asking is about the relationship between sexual assault, domestic violence, other forms of violence, and colonial inheritances and colonial legacies. And I wasn't seeing first person in this research. And this is a quotation from Noel Ignatieff, How the Irish Became White, talking about how he doesn't use first person experiences, but tries to collect from third person data an image of what the experience was like, rather than talking with American Irish people in Boston where he did this study. So I want to think about some first person research methods in philosophy, with and without philosophy, that can be decolonial methods. And so I'll just get right into them. My work is in philosophy of mind and thinking about what the nature of mind is, and in particular what the notion of what the nature of consciousness is. And classic issue in philosophy of mind is that conscious experience is not the kind of thing that can be explained by third person observation, by science. That there's something very recalcitrant about conscious experience. How can we use this in a decolonial way, as a liberatory way? And I've very much inspired by studies of double consciousness, starting with Du Bois's work, but then Lugones takes this up quite a bit, Deborah King and others, looking at double consciousness as playing with the tension between first person experience and third person observation, and what happens in within that tense relation. I'm also been inspired by decolonial psychology, some works written by Irish psychologists, liberation at the, specifically after the Troubles, talking about, how to decolonize the psyche and mental phenomena. Liberation at the psychic level can be seen as a journey or a developmental process, a movement from the steps of raising consciousness to taking action. So it's a collective phenomenon. Moving somewhat quickly here. I'm also inspired by phenomenology, which has a long tradition of looking at first person experience in a particular way. And recently there's been a surge of critical phenomenology that problematizes the tradition of phenomenology by thinking through women's bodies, thinking first person experience from particular social locations. Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex is a classic text in this area, and I think for this panel, it's a classic interdisciplinary text that has a chapter on biology, economics, sociology, psychology, literature, and again, plays with the tension between lived experience and the way that third person observation in academic works describes that experience. And the last thing I want to talk about that I think is a method that Lugonis brings to us is another method of engaging first-person experience in the way that, for example, she does in the world traveling essay just discussed, that really integrates a critical and coalitional examination of first-person experience with philosophical analysis, with political praxis. So it's not just an accounting of first-person experience, but really a political engagement and a collective engagement with how to see oneself in relation to others. So first-person experience in this sense is not an individualist experience, but it's actually a coalitional experience and a moment for a kind of connection. So engaging first-person experience, I think Lugonis gives us a model for engaging first-person experience in a concrete way and looking at complex histories and both transforming the discipline of philosophy in those ways, but also transforming other disciplines and making these disciplinary boundaries much more permeable. And it's also a methodology, this first-person methodology, that many authors in speaking face-to-face used, as speaking face-to-face is also a methodology of connecting with others and putting first-person experiences and strategies of resistance in dialogue with one another. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, please join me in thanking all our amazing panelists for sharing their nuggets with us. And I know that we're over time, so just to be respectful of your time, I don't think we'll have time for questions unless there are a couple in Zoom. Or Roberta? 5 minutes? I noticed that there were questions potentially in the Zoom chat, but probably if someone wants to pose a comment or a question that's very brief, feel free to come up to the microphone. Roberta is going to be our first question.
That's why we can have 5 minutes. No, at least
Presidential
I just
privilege.
wanted to say thank you so very much for this. It's very meaningful for me to have this panel in many ways. And I wish I had scheduled it better, but with all the rescheduling, we ended up having it here at this time with other things happening. But it's live stream, is recorded, and I know it's going to have a better audience in the future. I think what you shared is very important, and it puts us to work, right? There's no way in my imagination for us to be able to move forward feminism and feminist sociologies if we keep thinking in these silos, and everything that you said is giving us a lot of tools to be able to move forward. So really thank you for being here.
Yes. So I'm sure our speakers would be happy to answer any questions that you have. I'm just gonna offer that as one last opportunity for anyone. And you can always email them or talk to them after this conversation. Thank you so much again. Enjoy the rest of the evening, and we look forward to seeing you next year in New Orleans. Bravo. Gracias.